Fantastic.
Well, man, I'm really looking forward to getting into the music. I'm looking forward to talking about your career in music. What a wonderful lineup on Ancestral. So, thank you for taking a minute out today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So, let's begin our journey with this. I always begin with this. I've tried to shake this question, but I can't get away from it. 5 years ago, this pandemic was changing everything, especially for musicians. How did you get through that era, and how has it affected the way that you create and live today?
Well, yeah, it came at a really weird time for me. My wife and I moved to England in January of 2016. And I went over, basically, I received this PhD fellowship I was doing research on John Coltrane's two of his last recordings. One is Interstellar Space, the duo record with Rashid Ali, and the other was a recording called Stellar Regions, which came out, actually was recorded 1 week before Interstellar Space. So I was in England for about a year and a half, and then I was offered a full-time position as a professor there. So I started teaching about 20 and like the beginning of 2018. And so then when COVID hit, I was actually teaching full-time and doing PhD part-time. So it was super busy time for me anyway, but it kind of it threw everything into a lurch. And so it was tough. I was teaching basically 1 day a week in person. In the UK, they had different kind of rules. I've talked to friends who lived in the United States during it who were teaching, and they were just like not teaching in person at all. But we were teaching in person 1 day a week. And meanwhile, I was still trying to finish writing up the PhD and all of that. And after teaching there for about 4 years, the pandemic was coming to an end, and I was coming to the end of finishing the PhD. I'd always been, I hadn't been an academic before. I've done a lot of teaching, but it was always, in kind of one-to-one or going in and doing master classes at universities, conservatories, where I'd work with students sometimes for a day or sometimes for 3 or 4 days, but then that was kind of it. And so this was a totally new thing for me. And my wife and I, it was really taking way too much time, for my career. It was basically every day, all day kind of job. So at the end of the pandemic, we decided that we weren't going to stay there. And, but we wanted to stay in England because I lived in New York for almost 30 years. And so we were like, we know what that is, and we felt like staying in Europe was really what we wanted to do. So we scouted out a couple places, and I have a lot of friends in Portugal, and I'd been to coming to Portugal for over 20, 25 years. And so we're like, you know what, all the things lined up for Portugal, and we were super excited. So then at the end of 2021, I resigned my position, and we moved to Portugal basically in December of 2021. So, and COVID wasn't quite done, but it was kind of winding down. Even here, they had loosened up a lot of the rules and things, and so things were starting to open up. But for us, it was all of these life things kind of coincided, and big decisions were made during this period, and totally life changing for sure.
Yeah. So let's get into the album Ancestral. Andrew and Billy, it's a wonderful lineup. It seems like this was quite a big deal, this project. Talk to me about your idea, your artistic vision going into it.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, I'd been working on for probably more than a decade, working on analyzing, Coltrane's improvisations and kind of what lies behind them and that kind of thing. So, for me, that I I like to nerd out, but I felt like for me, I needed to finish this journey was to do a recording that reflected somewhat of that, and the idea of using two drummers was something that Coltrane did in on Meditations with Rashid Ali and Elvin, and on other recordings too, where there were extra percussionists, and a lot of musicians would join Train in a bunch of those recordings, like the one at Temple University and live in Seattle and stuff. So anyway, so my idea was that, I wanted it originally to be kind of a way of purging, of releasing all that stuff, but in a musical statement, right? So So I planned on using two drummers, and then I didn't want to use a bass player and a piano player because I don't feel like, I didn't want it to be copying the Coltrane thing, and I didn't want to do Coltrane tunes, and I didn't want to be anything like that because as musicians, we spend our lives dedicated to pursuing music and creating art. And all of our heroes and all of the people that influenced us throughout our lifetime are embodied in us when we play. It's all part of it. And so, in this record as being kind of, a not necessarily a Coltrane dedication. It became more of the reason I titled it Ancestral was a kind of a more general homage to all the ancestors of the music, which Coltrane, obviously is a big one for me. But and then picking Billy and talking to Billy and Andrew and asking them to be part of it. Their history in the music and also their incredible impact on music and musicians, as two titans of the drum set. So the title Ancestral is meant to reflect all of that. And so anyway, getting back to and choosing Ben Monder, who is one of the great living guitar players today, and I've been fortunate to know Ben for decades, and Ben used to work in one of my bands years ago, and so I knew that this combination of musicians with Ben playing guitar and with Andrew and Billy would be an amazing group with just incredible interplay and musical possibilities.
So at the end of the day, what are you hoping the listener gets from this album?
I hope, the music tells them a story and reaches people, on an emotional level, that, is exciting, that kind of, takes them out of their ordinary kind of frame of reference and brings something new to them, and but yet, I hope that they recognize, that it's not, music that's necessarily alien at all. It's very, I think, there's a lot of very, direct kind of melodic content and interplay that they can relate to.
So take me back to the beginnings in Anaheim. What made you pick up the horn? What made you pursue the jazz world? How did all of this begin?
Well, I was born in Anaheim in 1964, and my father was a machinist at North American Aviation, and he during the late 50s, early 60s, he was working on a lot of military aircraft, and then in the beginning of the 60s, he started working on the Apollo mission, the Apollo spacecraft, and he was part of the team that built the capsule that went to the moon, and so when I was a kid, I remember going and seeing that when it came back in 1969, amazing. I've got photos of it, Polaroid photos of us going to see it. And so anyway, that was my early childhood. Back then, I was listening to music a lot, and I can remember having a little reel-to-reel tape player with music that I'd recorded off the radio, and I would pretend I was a DJ. So I was, even at that age, I was like, maybe six, 5 or 6, I was into it. But when we moved, when I was about 7 years old to Spokane, Washington, to be closer to my family, my dad's side of the family. And it was when I was in about fifth grade that I started playing saxophone. And you have to choose an instrument. And in the 1970s, band programs all over the United States were really well funded, and every school had band, every school. So I loved the way the saxophone looked, and I thought, yeah, I want to play that. So I started in I think it was fifth grade, playing saxophone, and just taking lessons from my band teacher in school, playing band. And then when I got into junior high in seventh grade, I remember we had a band concert that there was a seventh and eighth grade and ninth grade concerts with choir and the orchestra and everything. And they had a middle school jazz big band. And I remember listening to it and going, and the saxophone player stood up and took solo. And I was like, and my teacher, who was the director, made a big point to announcing to the audience that he improvised that solo. And I was blown away. I was like, how do you do that? I have to know how to do that, right? So I started taking private lessons, not right then, but shortly after, like a year later, and started playing in the middle school jazz band, big band. Very lucky because we had band multiple times a week. I don't remember how often, but I would say 2 or 3 times a week. And then I started taking saxophone lessons shortly after that. So I caught the bug. And then when I got into high school, my high school band director was the director. His name is Bruce Preniger, the director of the local Spokane Jazz Society, and this professional group in town. And so he would bring in arrangements for us, and I was learning all the standard stuff, Sammy Nesico and all the, Dorsey and Glenn Miller, learning all that stuff by the time I was 15, 16. And then I would start to sub for the adults in the Spokane Jazz Society. And that was amazing, being a 15, 16-year-old kid, playing with all these adult musicians and really getting lucky to be in like subbing in concerts with people like Barney Kessel and um, there's a great singer from the North, or who lived in the Northwest, Ethel Ennis, and Joe Williams, the great jazz vocalist, and the tenor player, Don Lamprier, who we used to play with. He played with Charlie Parker, right? And he
Uh-huh.
came in. He came in as a guest artist, and I'm this dumb 16-year-old kid, So I was definitely bitten by the bug, and I joined the musicians union then would go to the musicians union and hang out. I remember doing a session one time and Charlie Rouse was in town playing, right? Well, he came to the session and I remember I was playing Scrapple from the Apple. And after I got done, Charlie Rouse like taps me on the shoulder and says, "Very good, young man."
Yeah.
So there was a lot of reinforcement and a lot of I owe a debt to all the teachers and the people that supported me when I was very young. But at that point, I had chosen, that was it.
That was it.
So yeah, then I went to Berkeley shortly thereafter when I graduated high school. And yeah.
It's always a dream for the musician to make it to New York. That's the place where everything kind of takes place. What was the first stage that you got on that you had dreamed about playing on that just you were like, okay, I'm here? Did you ever have a moment like that?
Yeah, not well. I do have a memory of like, this is the moment that I always wanted. It wasn't, I moved to New York in 1988. So it was like the spring of 88. And this happened, well, when I mean, met so many amazing people when I first moved to New York. And really, it was a great time to be in New York, late 80s through the 90s. The Knitting Factory had just opened, and there was all kinds of new music going on down there. And all the jazz masters were alive, so I mean I got to see everyone and luckily get to play with some of them too, and it was like it was a good time to be a jazz musician, but I remember for me the moment that really was really special was when I was playing in Joe Henderson's big band. And just because I was such a huge Joe fan. And I remember, the first night we were playing at the Blue Note, and I'm sitting, like basically 6 feet from Joe. And it was one of those things where, wow, I could have never imagined this.
Yeah. I'm curious, being around someone like Joe, and there's so many legends and luminaries that you played with. What did you learn from those kinds of personalities, not only about how to approach the bandstand and studio, but how to live life?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a difficult question because, a lot of musicians are genius, at their art, but then maybe kind of dysfunctional in life. And
Yeah,
then there are other people who figured it out, who actually have figured out, how to live and how to make it, But so I mean that's kind of that's a tricky question. I mean, I think, it's one of those things that when you're young, you're obsessive and there's so much um, that you want to learn and be able to express. And then as you get older, you understand, I think, a lot more about playing music is really not about, you know, it's not about quantity, but it's about being able to express in quality what you know. It's not about necessarily knowing everything. It's about just understanding what's important, and when to play and when not to play and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So, and and going out, I mean, the thing is that, and I don't see so much anymore, although in Portugal there's a great scene and there's a lot of really wonderful young players here, and you see them going out all the time. But I know that in the years before I moved to Europe, you would see fewer people going out to the clubs. There was a period right after 9/11 happened when the clubs in New York City kind of dropped off really drastically, and it never really came back in the same way. And the thing that I think that is so important for, especially for young musicians, is that you have to hear music, jazz live, because listening to recordings is great, and it's super important to understand, and to participate in the history of the music that way. But there's an intangible, ephemeral thing that understanding that you gain from seeing music in person that you'll never get from a recording.
Yeah.
You know?
What do you like the best about being a professional musician? You've been at it for a while. What gets you up every day? What makes you evolve and love this music and this profession you've chosen?
I think it's that there's always something new around the corner.
Yeah.
It's that music is forever interesting to me. It never ends. I'm always discovering new musicians that I'm blown away by. I recently discovered like a whole host. I had a student come and study with me from the rhythmic conservatory in Copenhagen, and he came for like a little over a week, and we hung out and studied. And he was turning me on to these young musicians from Scandinavia I didn't know who were fantastic. And, and having, being open and developing new ideas. There's so much stuff that I'm interested in that I just don't have time to necessarily get to. And even in classical music, I discovered a new composer, this Norwegian composer by accident, who's brilliant, who died in like 1952, who was like this like I wouldn't call him a 12-tone composer, but he's definitely had his own take on chromaticism that was different than Schoenberg. And the music's amazing, but he didn't write that much, and he died really young. And I just thought, how did I never hear of this person before? So, I mean, in that way, I feel like the same way now that I did when I was in my 20s. It's like there's this world out there just waiting to be discovered.
So when you have this dream of getting into music and making it your career, you imagine what your career is going to be like, what it's going to be like to be a musician all the time. So you have this dream and then you have this career that you've had. What's been the difference between the dream of getting into this world and the actual career that you've had?
Well, I mean, the world has changed so much. When I was coming up, it was, particularly the system that jazz musicians kind of came through was that, you would hopefully land a gig with one of the masters and then kind of learn from them, and then you go on to become a leader. I mean, that was like the tradition of in jazz forever, the Art Blakey School of Art Blakey University or whatever.
Yeah.
And I had a bit of that, but the idea that then, you could record and tour and make records and sell records. Now with streaming and the internet and the way that music has changed so much, and the jazz world, whatever that is, because it's a pretty big umbrella, has shrunk a lot. It's become more of a challenge, more musicians, not as many gigs. So it's gotten a lot tighter. But in spite of all those kind of obstacles, I'm always amazed at how creative and how, many great young artists there are, and how that the music's going to survive and it will continue and it'll flourish and it'll change. But in spite of all of this, so I know when I was young, it was totally different. You could there, that you would be a studio musician. You could go and be doing jingles during the day. I had friends that were doing jingles, and there was a bit of that like in the late 80s, but then synthesizers and all of the electronics wiped that out by, mid 90s, late 90s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, why do you love this art form we call jazz?
Um, because it represents the best of humanity.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, John, everyone has a perception of you, family, friends, fans, everyone on the bandstand, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Wow. Well, I'm still trying to figure that out.
Yeah,
I have a better idea than I did years ago. I think, I know all my good and bad qualities, and I've learned to accept them both.
yeah,
And and that's it. Just try to be as true to yourself as you can be. And I think that in my career I have been. I the music speaks the truth, and you can hear the truth in the music. So if something's phony, immediately. You can't bullshit musicians.
I agree. So let me ask you this. What was the first live jazz show you saw that absolutely blew you away?
That's a good question. There's a couple, and I think for me, because early on I was a huge and I'm still, but my first true love was Cannonball Adderley,
Yeah,
and I was nuts over Cannonball, and I bought all his records, and I to this day I made it my goal to collect everything he recorded, and I think I've pretty much done it.
wow.
In terms of all of the original pressings. Now there's been some things that have come out that I haven't kept up with. But so there was a time, there was a jazz club in Spokane when I was a kid called the Tin Ear. And I remember vividly, I was only 16 and you couldn't get in the club, right? But somehow I snuck in with some friends who were older. And I saw Nat Adderley play with Sonny Fortune, Walter Booker, Jimmy Cobb, and Larry Willis. And it was fantastic. And Nat was still playing a bunch of the old, Boy with the Sad Eyes and, some of his hits and compose. But man, and Sonny Fortune sounded amazing. Sonny was playing alto. And Jimmy Cobb, I mean, kind of blues right
Yeah,
there. It was amazing. And for the 16-year-old me, that was a revelation.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So if anybody wants to pick up a copy of Ancestral, they want to catch you live, any of the good business in your role, where's the best place for them to go?
Ancestral's, I think maybe the easiest place is you can pick it up on and I'm spacing on the website.
Bandcamp?
Yes, it's available either as digital download or CD and also LP.
Okay.
So yeah, so it's available on that site. Although I think you can order it through. It's got really good distribution in the United States and throughout Europe. So you can find it on whatever your favorite site is, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
All
so
right. I love it. I will put links in the show notes. John, so great to meet you, sir. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it, man.
thank you.
And before you